Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club, where we're reading the book entitled Dwelling in the Secret Place by Sonica Veith. This is an ebook available online for free at clashofminds.com, where you can download it and read along with us. Sonica Veith is the spouse of well-known evangelist, lecturer, university professor, and zoologist Dr. Walter Veith. And this true story is a chronicle of their life together, their ministry, their numerous trials, tribulations, and hardships, as well as their successes, victories, and triumphs. In our last reading, we covered chapter 3, entitled Haunted House. In this chapter, Sonica leaves home and travels to Cape Town to attend Stellenbosch University and to meet Walter, who was now a postgraduate student there. He was to meet her at the train station, but he never showed up, and she felt so alone and abandoned that she wished she had never come. Additionally, there was the nightmare of university initiation, which drove her deeper into her naturally withdrawn character. However, she eventually found out that Walter was very sick and in hospital because of malnutrition and a highly compromised immune system, all due to his not eating, since he could barely get by on the little income he earned from his jobs while having to pay his tuition. But having found him, sick as he was, she now felt secure. As the years passed, she realized Walter was always the center of attention and also loved to drink. His friends were all older than her, and she would feel very inferior around them, and they would make fun of her. But Walter would always intervene and take over the situation. Sometimes in a restaurant, Walter would get drunk and stand up on the table and regale the whole restaurant with his jokes that would have everyone rolling with laughter. One day, Walter took her to meet his dad and stepmother. She, the stepmother, was terrible and cast accusations and insults at Sonica, who fled crying into the nearest room. She couldn't believe anyone could be so cruel. Nevertheless, in June of 1974, she and Walter got married and moved to Durban, close to her parents' home, when Walter got a job at the Durban Westville University. It was here that a friend of Walter's visited them and told them that he had used the Ouija board to speak to the dead, and invited them to try it so Walter could contact his mom. They did it, and it was the worst thing that could ever have happened to them. The Ouija board told them in a very powerful and sinister way to go to hell, and they discovered that they had opened the way for very strange and supernatural things to happen to them. Their new and beautiful home began to seem haunted. First, their brand new car did strange things. Then one night, all the dishes on the drying rack overturned, and on another occasion, there seemed to be someone in the house. Then at another time, a stuffed black cat, which had been in a box high up in a cupboard, appeared in their bed one night when they came home. They asked her father what was going on, and he came over and threw garlic cloves all around the house and made pentagram signs, but to no avail. The strange events kept happening, and Walter remembered that Catholic priests were also exorcists, and he went straight to the nearest Catholic church. The priest agreed to come immediately, and with a little bottle of holy water and a small exorcist book, he walked through the house, spilling drops of holy water and reading from his book, and then left. That night, they heard footsteps coming down the steps toward their bedroom, and their dog growled and rushed to the door, but saw nothing. They were terrified. Then there was a loud knock on the door, and then receding footsteps, and then nothing. And after many months of no more incidents, they recognized that their visitor had truly gone. At least, so they thought. Dear listeners, please don't forget that you can download this book for free at clashofminds.com and read along with us as we pick up the story today with chapter 4, entitled Groping Through the Darkness. Ephesians 6 and verse 12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. A few months later, we discovered that I was pregnant. We were baffled that the prediction of the lady from the 19th century actually came true. Was my father right after all? Could it be that there is an unseen realm where spirits of the dead live? And if they were not the dead, who were they? The company my father was working for had moved to Johannesburg, and my father came home only for the weekends, sometimes only every second weekend. My mother was unable to quit her post at the university because of the house and other commitments, and it wasn't long before they started drifting apart. A male friend of the family, one of my mother's colleagues, started taking care of things around the house, and a friendship developed which brought my mother to the point where she felt torn between the two but couldn't make a decision. One night, we woke up with soft tapping on our bedroom window. We peeped through the curtains, and to our surprise, my father was standing outside in the dark. "I don't know what to do with your mother. She won't wake up," he said with an unusual urgency in his voice. We knew she sometimes took something to help her sleep, but something didn't seem right. We quickly got dressed and followed my father home in our car. The moment we saw my mother lying there, sprawled out in an unusual position, we knew something really serious was wrong. She had a sickly, grayish complexion and wouldn't respond to anything. "This is bad. This is very bad," Walter said to himself as he inspected the bottles of pills on her bedside table. It was obvious that she had taken an overdose of sleeping tablets. We carried her to the car and struggled to get her into the back seat of our two-door Passat. I was about 7 months pregnant at the time and struggled to hold her on my lap as we raced to the nearest hospital, only to learn that they refuse to take suicide cases. We then had to drive all the way to a hospital in Durban, approximately 30 kilometers away. Walter pushed our little car to its limit, and we arrived not a minute too soon. Her life was saved, but unfortunately, as we learned later, not her marriage. The rest of our stay in Nanton was rather uneventful. Walter had proved himself in the academic world and was offered a better post at his alma mater, Stellenbosch University. We were happy to go back so that I could finish my BA degree and Walter his PhD. But we struggled to sell the house in an increasingly unstable political and economic climate. We were forced to rent it out to a young lawyer and his wife, who proved that professional people are not always the best tenants. Within a year, our lovely home was reduced to an unsightly, ruined house, and when it was eventually sold, we barely recovered the loan that we had on it. By the time we had to move, I was 8 months pregnant. So we decided that I fly down to Cape Town, leaving Walter with the grueling task of driving the approximately 1,500 kilometers with a Rottweiler, a Persian, and a Siamese cat in our little two-door car stacked to the ceiling with our personal belongings. We rented a little laborer's cottage on a farm on top of Hell's Hook Day Pass, just outside Stellenbosch. It wasn't the best, with its huge cracks in the damp walls, only a sink in the room that was supposed to be a kitchen, and no cupboards at all. We had very little money and hardly any furniture, but managed to prepare a room for the baby that was soon to be born by scraping together some second-hand odds and ends. Our first son was a few months old when riots broke out in the entire Cape area. Everywhere, mobs stoned passing cars, and some areas were impossible to pass through. Since we lived up on the mountain, some 10 kilometers from Stellenbosch, we had to travel down the pass and through a little village to get to the town. This was impossible without getting killed. Therefore, the farming community was escorted to town with an armed police vehicle in the front and one at the back of the convoy. Farmers, and even their colored laborers, were also threatened by the rioters, and we were mostly confined to our homes. It was not unusual for farm workers to knock at our door in desperate need of medical attention after having been stabbed several times by their own people. In view of the increasing violence, we decided to move to town, where it would be safer for me and the baby during the day while Walter was at work. We moved into a small semi-detached house in Stellenbosch, and when our son Martin was just over 1.5 years old, I needed to complete my degree, or else my first 2 years of studying would have been in vain while Walter was completing his PhD. I enrolled the toddler at a creche, and after many tears shed by both mother and child, we eventually settled down, and I was able to concentrate on my studies. Although he got sick quite often, and we got very little sleep, Martin was a placid child who spent hours playing quietly by himself, and we managed to complete our degrees. 2 years later, our daughter was born, and we decided to have our first house built in an area where the children would have space to run around. We managed to make some profit from the house we sold, and soon we moved into the new house with a small loan from the bank. I started doing pottery and giving classes at home and at the technical college in order to be with the children and to supplement our income while Walter was getting more and more involved in his work and the research he was doing. He now had his doctorate and many postgraduate students apart from the hundreds of undergraduates. He was successful and passionate about his work and was satisfied that the theory of evolution, as was taught to the students, provided adequate proof of our origins. He needed no God and had no intention of bringing him into our lives. Besides, The spectacle some of the charismatic churchgoers made of themselves on Sunday television made him turn away in disgust and anger. When students dared to disagree about the theory of evolution, he enjoyed pulling them to pieces in front of all the other students. Even the strongest of men battled to survive the sting of his German tongue, which, as personal experience taught me, seemed to have the ability to cut through concrete and steel. But even worse is an ardent, atheist German tongue, which is something you would rather not wish to encounter. During this time, we had to give Walter's father and stepmother the opportunity to see the grandchildren. But his stepmother made it so unpleasant and difficult for all of us that we had to meet his father in a hotel when he wanted to see us. One Sunday, when Walter tried to phone his father, he couldn't get through, and after several attempts he gave up. The whole week, he tried to reach his father's house, but with no success. Eventually, as he was ready to contact the telephone company, the phone rang and his stepmother answered. "You'll have to come and see your father. He's not normal, you know." She laughed. "When I show him a bunch of keys, he tells me it's an apple." We hurriedly got the children into the car and drove to Cape Town. Walter's father was lying in bed, staring with a distant look in his eyes at the commotion around him. His stepmother picked up the keys from the table and asked mockingly, "Now, Julie, tell me what I'm holding in my hand." His eyes turned toward her hand. "Flowers. Bunch of flowers," he said. She smiled with a strange "I told you so" expression on her face. "So now it's flowers. Are you sure it's flowers, Julie?" Then she turned to us and said, "You know, when you give him something to read out loud, he'll make up his own story. His mind is gone." "How long has he been like this?" Walter was concerned and annoyed at her mocking his father in his condition. "Oh, a few days." "Why didn't you phone us earlier?" She hesitated. "I didn't want to bother you." Walter shook his head in disbelief and mumbled something to himself as he started dressing his father to take him to the hospital. After doing the necessary brain scans, the neurologist discovered a brain tumor in such a delicate spot in the brain that surgery would be impossible. And after a few days, he was sent home with the sure sentence of only a few months to live. We decided to take him home with us and make his last few days as pleasant as possible, out in the country with his children and grandchildren, and away from the constant conflict in his home. Walter's stepmother complained bitterly, but we insisted. After a few weeks with us, he seemed to recover slightly and had some moments of clarity during which he asked us what was wrong with him. When he realized he had little time to live, he told us that his testament was in a trust at some insurance company and that he had made Walter one of the executors of his will. He also mentioned who was to inherit what and wanted confirmation that everything was still in order, and asked Walter to contact his wife for the details. When Walter told her of his father's wish, she went on a tangent, accusing us of trying to meddle with his will, and refused to disclose any details. We didn't want to cause the dying man any further pain and left it at that. After his death, a few months later, we discovered why Walter's stepmother had reacted so strangely. According to two acquaintances down the road from their house, they were asked by his stepmother to come to his father's house one day. His wife had noticed that something was wrong with his mind and saw a golden opportunity. She took the phone off the hook for a week, which explained why we couldn't get through. She then proceeded to have a codicil to his will and testament drawn up, bequeathing to herself some property he had, and got the two ladies to come up to the house to be witnesses to the signing of the document. When they arrived, the confused man was in bed. She brought him the document and asked him to sign it. He received the document and pen without questioning it, but was unable to sign, whereupon his wife placed the pen in his hand and guided the signature along the line. The signature did not turn out to be on the line, but almost 45 degrees to the line, and was very shaky, nothing like the firm handwriting he had before. In the meantime, the insurance company that handled the trust refused to even speak to Walter, let alone allow him to have any insights into the will, even though he was one of the executors. We learned that his stepmother had blackened his name to such a degree with the company where her brother happened to be one of the previous directors that they refused to deal with someone of such vile and deceptive character. His stepmother no doubt reasoned that if he was discredited, Walter wouldn't have any insight into the will, and her little deception might have remained a secret forever, little knowing that the two witnesses had already contacted us. When Walter's sister in America heard what had happened, she insisted we take the stepmother to court, not to regain the property in question, but primarily to see justice done. Walter, his sister, and the advocate felt that they had a good case, seeing that the two witnesses were willing to testify. But what happened made us realize that there is no justice on this earth. We had to learn the very expensive lesson that no earthly advocate or judge or any human being was able to protect us and fight our case against injustice and set the record straight. The case was brought to the Supreme Court, and the neurologist at the hospital testified that there was no possibility that his father was able to comprehend what he was signing. Unlike America, the South African judicial system does not require a person to be by sound, body, and mind when he or she signs a document. Thus, the defense argued that the document was valid, even though he hadn't agreed to it or didn't understand its contents fully. The judge, after thorough questioning, realized what the outcome would be and took Walter and his advocate aside and asked them to withdraw the case, his reason being that he had no doubt as to the stepmother's character, but according to the letter of the law, he would have to grant the verdict in her favor, which he found very hard to do. They withdrew, and we were liable for all costs. But at least Walter's credibility was restored to some extent, and he was able to work together with the insurance company that handled the trust without further unpleasantness. The next hurdle, however, was awaiting them. There was the inevitable contention of where his father was to be buried. While alive, his wish was to be buried in the family grave of Walter's mother. But the stepmother refused, and after many bitter discussions, they decided to leave the location of the grave to the undertaker. After Walter's poor father had been on ice for many days, The day of the funeral arrived, and to everyone's surprise, the undertaker had chosen out of thousands of available ones a space so close to his mother's grave that the two corners met. As they all watched the coffin sink down into the depths of the earth, Walter's eyes swept over his mother's grave, and he wondered if this was a coincidence or interference from the spirit world. Had his deceased mother guided the undertaker in his choice? His stepmother naturally thought that some bribery had taken place and never spoke a word to us at the funeral or ever after that. The saddest of all was that a few weeks after the will was settled and she received her inheritance along with the self-bequeathed property, she suddenly died without warning. Her death certificate stated, "Cause of death unknown." We strangely felt sorry for the lonely soul who was so unhappy in this life and failed to find peace neither in earthly relationships nor in possessions. It was a few months before the dust had settled and our lives were more or less back to normal when my father phoned. He explained that he and my mother got divorced and that he remarried none other than Merle, the many times divorced mother of my childhood friend Ivan, who had died in the car accident in Natal. "Oh no," I said tiredly to Walter. "Now we have to deal with another stepmother. But at least she couldn't possibly be anything like yours was. At least I don't think so." They had moved down to Johannesburg from the Cape and settled in a little seaside resort, Hermanus, just over an hour's drive from Stellenbosch. My father was working at an advertising agency in Cape Town and found it too hard to drive the distance from Hermanus, so we encouraged him to stay with us during the week and drive home for the weekend. We got on well with my father, and our two children, Martin and Tanya, enjoyed him very much. He thought they were the best behaved little ones he had ever seen and spent much time playing and talking with them. He was no trouble at all and stayed with us for more than 2 years. My mother, however, was concerned about the fact that my father and his wife had moved into our lives. During conversations with my mother, as well as my father, we learned that my stepmother was deeply involved in the New Age movement and was considered to be one of the enlightened teachers of courses such as A Course in Miracles. In this course, students are taught that they need to realize and develop their own inner power, which will enable them to perform any kind of miracle. According to her teaching, any human being had the ability to become like God. They only needed to discover their own divinity. Once a day, she would meditate, and sometimes some spirit would manifest himself to her to teach and guide her. We started feeling very uncomfortable about my father's involvement with her, especially after we were told that her sister, a well-known award-winning author and poet, had doused herself in fuel, stretched herself out on a cross on a hill in Spain, and set herself alight. She survived, but claimed that it was an accident, and in her badly scarred state, she continued her writing in South Africa. During this time, I seemed to be constantly sick. I had either pneumonia or bronchitis and constant asthma. When I fell pregnant with our third child, I was so sick and had lost so much weight that I had to be hospitalized. My doctor didn't know what was wrong. I had no infection in my lungs this time, but had a constant high fever. They suspected uterine septicemia, usually caused by the death of the fetus, and the doctors were ready to do an abortion when Walter decided to take me to have an ultrasound scan. In those days, the hospitals were not equipped to do the tests, and patients were sent to private medical centers. I was too weak to walk and had a high temperature, which meant he had to drive me there and physically carry me with the drip still attached to my arm up the stairs and into the building. The scan showed a tiny little fellow, the size of a finger, happily sucking his thumb. We were back at the drawing board. No physical explanation could be given for my condition, and after a few days of antibiotics, I was sent home. The rest of my pregnancy, I struggled from one fever to the next and had a constant, irritating cough for most of the 9 months. When Robert was born, he had a deep frown in his little forehead and screamed night and day. I struggled to feed him and had to keep him wrapped up tightly to prevent him from scratching himself and fighting everything around him. I didn't have a moment's peace, not even to have a meal. The little guy constantly needed to be rocked, and I even tried to tie him onto my back as the African women do, but I wasn't well enough endowed at the right places to keep him there, and he kept on slipping down. At night, he slept a restless hour or two at a time, waking up and screaming for an hour in between. We were tired beyond description. Fortunately, Martin, aged 9, and Tanya, who was 5, were at school during the morning, and in the afternoons they were able to help with taking care of their very demanding brother. At the same time, the pressure at Walter's work was increasing. He was working in a very competitive department with socially amiable, as long as you got drunk with them, but professionally hostile colleagues. The undergraduate as well as postgraduate student load was high, and the tension and lack of sleep at home contributed to his irritability and bad moods. It became nothing unusual for him to put his fist right through a door in a fit of rage and then bemoan his situation when his hand got stuck. He was constantly scolding and complaining, and more than once he turned over the table with all the cups of coffee and other breakables on it and left me to clean up the mess. The children and I, as well as our pets, developed the skill of staying out of his way when he had a bad day at work. It was usually only after the first whiskey of the evening, a beer, and a few glasses of wine that he started to calm down. I began to wonder what had happened to that positive, in-control person I used to know. Even his facial expression changed, and a dark, restless look started settling in his blue eyes. Many nights, I lay awake on my tear-drenched pillow while the others were sleeping, remembering the unkind words of Walter's stepmother. "I hope you cry for the rest of your life." Her wish certainly seemed to have come true. Was there no one who understood what I was going through? Was there no one who could help? One night, something happened that would be the catalyst for changing our lives forever. Exactly at 2 a.m, Walter woke up, struggling to breathe, with his heart racing. "I had a terrible dream. I dreamt someone was trying to strangle me," he panted as he wiped the beads of perspiration from his face. He had hardly finished telling me when Robert started screaming at a blood-curdling pitch. He was now about 1.5 years old, and although his sleeping pattern had slightly improved, he usually still had a restless night. But this was something different. As we ran to his room, our first thought was that somehow he managed to fall from his cot. But he was lying on his back in his bed, his little hands stretched out for us to pick him up, and his eyes wide and filled with fear. "Maybe he had a bad dream too," I said, as he settled down somewhat in my arms. But as I was holding him, I could feel his temperature rising, and no medicine or cold water sponges seemed to bring much relief. We struggled through the night to keep his temperature down, and just before dawn, he fell asleep. The next day, I took him to the doctor, who found no infection in his ears or throat or in his lungs. He was, however, not well for almost a week, but recovered eventually, and soon all was forgotten. Although he had become generally easier to handle during the day, he was insecure and hated being alone. A couple of weeks later, the same thing happened. At 2:00, Walter dreamt that he was being strangled, and a few seconds later, Robert would be screaming in his bedroom next to ours. Once again, his temperature would rise to above 40 degrees Celsius. But this time, we were not able to control the temperature, and he subsequently got fever fits. We phoned our doctor and rushed him to the hospital, where they put a drip on him and placed him in a cooling tent to try and stabilize him. The nursing staff battled through the night, and by morning there was a slight improvement. He was kept in hospital for a few days and sent home, where he struggled to regain his strength. This carried on several times, and each time the child would turn almost at the grave. It became more and more clear to us that this was no normal situation. Though clutching at any supernatural explanation at first, we had to admit that once again there was some supernatural interference in our lives, as during the time when we lived in Natal. When we asked my father, he had no explanation as to why this was happening to us. In Natal, he reasoned it could have been some unhappy departed spirit that returned to the family that lived in the house before us. But in this case, no one lived here before us, since we built the house ourselves. And fortunately, he didn't offer his garlic remedy again. Just as we thought we had some peace, it would happen again. One particular night, Robert was lying in his hospital bed with his usual high fever. The doctor had inserted the drip into a vein in his head just above the eye because his arms were punctured and swollen from the drips, which made it difficult to find a vein. Walter and I had been taking turns to stay with him in the hospital, and this night was Walter's turn. He had taken the students' exam scripts with him and was sitting on the vacant hospital bed, marking them, when Robert started shaking and shivering from the fever. It was 2:00. Walter picked him up and tried to calm him down, but his little body was shaking so badly that the drip was torn from his head. Blood poured down from the wound and streamed down his haggard, little face. As he stood there with the child in his arms, Walter said to himself, "This has gone too far. It's way beyond coincidence. I have to find help. I cannot handle 1 second more of this." His mind went back to the problem we had in our house in Natal, and he suddenly remembered that the Catholic priest was able to put an end to the trouble. All the years, he was unwilling to admit it. But now, we were desperate and had nowhere to turn to. I arrived at the hospital to take over the morning shift and found him in a nervous state, not merely from lack of sleep, but from the realization that he once again was facing a problem that he couldn't resolve himself. For him, with his "I can do it myself and I don't need any help" mindset, this was a major traumatic experience. He left the hospital and went straight to the Catholic Church in Stellenbosch. He had to search for it, but eventually found the little parish and knocked on the door, rolling up his sleeves to try and hide Robert's blood on his cuffs. Who knows what the priest would think when he saw that? He had to knock a second time before the door opened a teeny crack, just enough to peep through. "Yes?" a man's voice asked hoarsely. "I have to see the priest." Walter was ever so slightly irritated with the fact that he was forced to ask for help from an institute which hardly brought back fond memories. "About what?" came the voice. "Well, I have a problem." The door opened wide enough for Walter to see the drawn, unshaven face and sallow complexion of a man in his 40s or early 50s. "Come inside." The man turned, offered Walter a chair, and sat down behind his desk. "What is it you would like to tell me?" Walter realized that this was the priest, but he wasn't anything like he expected him to be. As a little boy, he had a great respect bordering on fear for the priest on the other side of the confessional box, who seemed to know everything and had so much power. Walter's eyes scanned the office. It was dark and stuffy. On the desk stood a brandy bottle. The room smelt of stale air and old, dusty books. "I have a problem in my home," Walter started cautiously, as he watched the disinterested expression on the priest's face. "There are strange things happening in my house." He got no further when the priest sat upright and said, "I don't want to hear anything about that. I don't deal with that. I will have someone contact you. Just give me your phone number." And with that, he greeted Walter and showed him to the door. Irritated and disgruntled, Walter walked back to his car, mumbling to himself, "Thanks for nothing," while his mind was reverting back to finding his own solution to the problem. He went home, had a quick shower, and drove to work, putting the experience of the night and the morning out of his mind. A few days later, we received an unusual phone call. A priest, who calmly introduced himself as Father McAllen, said that he had been informed of our situation and would like to see Walter at the convent in Strand, which was some 20 kilometers from Stellenbosch. We were amazed. We had given up all hope of any help from the church, and to tell the truth, we had second thoughts and were reluctant to get them involved. What if they don't believe us and thought we were crazy? We had spoken to no one beside my father and wished to keep it that way. That same day, Walter drove to the convent, where he was taken to the small lounge to meet with Father McAllen. He was a very dignified man in his 70s, very calm and polite, and made a good impression on Walter. He started talking slowly and in a serious tone. "I'm glad you have come. I know it has been a difficult time for you, and I would like to help you. Maybe I should tell you first what has been going on," Walter said, as he shifted a little to prepare to tell him the story. "Oh, that won't be necessary at all. I know the devil is trying to kill your youngest child," he said, as he nodded his head in sympathy. Walter nearly fell off the chair. "How? Just how? Did anyone tell you this?" he stammered, frantically trying to remember whether he had told anyone else but my father. "No," came the answer calmly. "But I can tell you this. I already have the permission to say a mass in your home. You see, your case is very serious, and I do believe it will be necessary to say a mass. You say you're a Catholic?" Walter just nodded, somewhat sheepishly, hoping that the old man could not read his thoughts as well. "Then, you do know," the priest continued, "that we cannot say Mass just anywhere, but under rare and special conditions it is allowed. I've had the letters of permission from the bishop and have been fasting for you for a week already, but to wait till I could be here in the Strand to meet with you. If it would be convenient for you, you can take me to your house now, and then bring me back to the convent afterwards, if you please." "Of course," Walter said softly. As they walked to the car, he searched his memory, trying to understand how it was possible that the priest could have asked the bishop for permission almost a week before Walter spoke to the local priest in Stellenbosch. On top of it all, he knew what had been going on without anyone telling him. Where did he get his information from? On the way to Stellenbosch, Walter asked him whether he often had to deal with this kind of situation. "Oh yes, many times. I deal mainly with exorcisms, but not all of the same nature as in your case." They drove on in silence for a couple of minutes, when Walter remembered that only Catholics could take part in the Mass. "What about my wife? She's not Catholic. Will that make a difference?" "No, but don't worry. She will believe," was all the exorcist had to say. When I walked into the lounge to meet Father McAllen, he greeted me courteously, and I saw the imprints of a long and mysterious life in his face. He asked me to fetch some water in a bowl from the kitchen, which he placed on the table, and then proceeded to take a little box from his pocket. He opened the box, took some consecrated salt from it, and sprinkled it in the form of a cross on the water, thus creating the holy water. He walked from one window to the next and painted a cross on the glass with his finger. As the water evaporated, it left a visible salt cross on the window pane. When he came to Robert's room, it seemed like he was losing his balance and started swerving backwards and forwards. Walter stood behind him ready to catch him, thinking he was perhaps feeling faint. But he recovered and continued to the next room as if nothing had happened. When he came into our bedroom, he once again seemed to have lost his balance for a while and then turned facing us. "We have to say the Mass in the baby's room. It's worse there," he mumbled as if to himself looking distressed. I hurried to fetch a table and a white tablecloth and some chairs. An awkward, nervous silence descended upon our home as we sat and watched as the old priest prepared for the Mass. From his wide priestly gown, he presented several little boxes and placed them on the table. He opened the larger one, revealing some round wafers. Once again, his hand disappeared into an invisible pocket to reach for his little book. He paged through it slowly and started to read something in Latin. Through the monotonous foreign droning, I heard the sound of footsteps softly pattering down the passage. Our faithful friend Mayet came walking into the room, followed by our Persian and Siamese cats. They made themselves comfortably and quietly watched the proceedings. The priest lifted the round wafer up and pronounced that the bread, through the meditation of the priest, had been transformed into the body of Christ. I felt uneasy and confused. What strange thing is happening to us, I thought. I just wanted it all to go away. I desperately wanted my life back. Everything had become so complicated. I watched as Walter opened his mouth to receive the little round host the priest placed on his tongue. After some more prayers and Latin citations, the Mass was over, and the priest opened the other little boxes. In them were some genuine relics of some saint that the old man received from Lourdes. These you have to hang above the beds of your other 2 children, as well as your own, for protection. The old man paused for a while, and I noticed that he was very tired. He then took his own ordination cross from his neck and gave it to us. This you must hang above the bed of your youngest son. We invited him to stay for something to drink, but he wanted to be taken back to the convent as soon as possible. "What do we owe you?" Walter asked. His scientific mind still seemed to refuse to see the unusual happenings as anything other than merely a business deal, a service rendered. The priest wanted no money, but I refused to let him leave without anything, so I ran to my pottery studio to fetch my largest and best pot that I had made and urged him to take it as a token of our gratitude. "All right," he said. "I shall donate it to the nuns in Cape Town that never see the outside world." And after greeting, they left. As I watched the car disappear around the corner, I mulled over the strange things that had happened. But soon it was put out of my mind as I rushed to fetch the children from school. That night, when it was time to put the children to bed, we hung the amulets above Martin and Tanya's beds and the crucifix above Robert's bed. We braced ourselves as we carried Robert to his bedroom, expecting the usual ritual of screaming and the consequent lengthy rocking procedure to get him to fall asleep. But tonight was different. We put him down in his cot and waited for him to let loose his familiar siren. But to our surprise, instead of curling up into a fetal position, he lay flat on his back, chattering to himself for a little while, and fell asleep with his arms spread out in a relaxed position. This was the first time in almost 2 years. Walter and I looked at each other, and that awkward, uneasy feeling crept over us once more. We were forced to acknowledge that the Catholic Church had done it again. Once again, peace and health returned to our home. In the weeks and months to come, we held our breaths, wondering how long it would last. there was still that nagging feeling at the back of our minds, relentlessly popping up like a scary Jack-in-the-Box character. Was there any guarantee that a mere human being could permanently save us from our sentence of misery on this wretched planet? And this through some salty water, a little round biscuit, a couple of bone chips from a deceased good Catholic, and some Latin words? The end of Chapter 4 of Dwelling in the Secret Place by Sonica Veith.